Now we consider intentional torts to property interests and defenses to intentional torts. Once again, this material is quite straightforward and there aren't that many theories. As we consider intentional torts to property, we keep in mind that these torts can either go to real property or to personal property. We can call personal property chattels. And so the torts that we will consider will be trespass to land, trespass to chattels, and conversion. Those are the intentional torts to property interests. The intentional tort to land of trespass is commonly tested, and it's worth taking a step back for a moment and acknowledging that this is where the law of torts and the law of real property touch one another. And so in many jurisdictions, some of these intentional torts to land can be tested as part of a real property question. So remember that a civil plaintiff will have to have a theory of liability and will have to have defenses. Sometimes we will see that the theory of liability can be principally out of real property and still involve tort principles. So, as we consider first trespass to land, we see that the basic elements of trespass to land include the physical invasion of the defendant's property. And as we'll see, it doesn't have to be for very long, and the intent doesn't have to be the same sort of specific intent to do harm that, say, assault with a deadly weapon might require. But still, we've got to have a physical invasion, we've got to have intent, and we've got to have causation. If the plaintiff can't show those things, the plaintiff is not entitled to recover for trespass to property. But there are a few fairly commonly tested details about trespass to property, trespass to land, that's worth being aware of. First, the plaintiff does not have to show that the defendant used force to gain entry. As we'll see, very likely on the multi-state, a defendant can merely back his or her vehicle up the wrong driveway. And if they deliberately went up that driveway, even if they didn't think that driveway belonged to somebody other than themselves, that's probably good enough to satisfy the intent requirement, and there's no force required. It is worth remembering that consent, either express or implied, will defeat a theory of intentional trespass to land. So if we've got somebody making a delivery for a store, there is express or implied consent to come onto the land of the person to whom the delivery is being made. Also, there is a privilege defense to trespass to land where there is an emergency or to protect the plaintiff's property. So if the defendant sees a fire on the plaintiff's land, the plaintiff will not be able to accuse the defendant of intentional trespass if that defendant comes onto the plaintiff's land deliberately for the purposes of putting out that fire. Also, the defendant doesn't need to know that his or her trespass is wrongful to be liable. The defendant only need to have intended to do the act that resulted in the trespass. This is another way of referring to fact patterns that are analogous to backing up the wrong driveway. The intent to back up the driveway is enough, even if the plaintiff thought that driveway was his or her own. That's it for trespass to land. Now we turn to trespass to chattels. Trespass to chattels is one of the most insignificant intentional torts. An example often used in school involves the professor taking a pen or pencil off the desk of one of the students and waving it around for a few moments. So a trespass to chattels is an act by the defendant that interferes with the plaintiff's right of possession. The defendant has to intend the trespass, and the acts of the defendant have to cause some interference with the plaintiff's right to possess and enjoy this item. Also, the plaintiff has to show damages. And both for trespass to chattels and for negligent infliction of emotional distress, the plaintiff has to show actual damages. Nominal damages are almost certainly not good enough, although some jurisdictions have requirements that are slightly different from one another. But the national law is you've got to show more than nominal damages to recover for trespass to chattels or for negligent infliction of emotional distress. Now, it's worth remembering here again in Trespass to Chattels that the defendant need not know that his or her act is wrongful to be liable. So if somebody accidentally picks up somebody else's laptop because it's identical to his or her own, so defendant acts thinking the property is hers, well, that's not a defense to liability for trespass to chattels. Trespass to chattels is not necessarily the same thing as theft. It just is an interference with possession. Now, turning to conversion. Conversion is an intentional tort to property that basically results in the destruction of that property. It's an act by the defendant that more or less permanently interferes with the plaintiff's right to possess that property. The interference has to be serious enough to require the replacement of the item in damages. Now, a little fine point on remedies here is we will judge the value of the item converted based on the day of the conversion, not based on the day of trial. So if there's been a big price spike, either right before or right after the act, that the date of the trespass is of the conversion is what we will use to determine damages in that theory of liability. Now, conversion requires either the destruction of the item altogether or the defendant must have failed to return the item after demands from the plaintiff. So conversion can be pretty much the same thing as theft, but generally it involves the destruction of an item. But here again, we can see how the law of torts is parallel to the law of crimes. And that's one reason why it often can be deemed appropriate to study criminal law right after you study torts, because the same mental processes apply in judging the conduct of the defendant. And that basically is it for intentional torts. We next turn briefly to consider defenses to intentional torts. Now, as we've gone through the theories of liability, I have alluded to some of the major defenses, but let's take a moment and consider them separately. The biggest defenses to intentional torts are consent or privilege. And the consent defense has to be either express or implied, and the implied consent often arises in sports or in rescues, where a person is trying to save somebody else. There is typically implied consent to what would otherwise be a harmful or offensive touching. If you're drowning and the lifeguard needs to grab you by the hair or by the neck to save your life, you basically have consented to that if the alternative is drowning. And again, we can see questions that will result in a successful plaintiff despite a possible defense of implied consent, but you need to understand that that argument is available to the defendant. Also, remember that consent cannot extend to permitting a criminal act. So if we've got a plaintiff who suffers from a psychological disorder in which the plaintiff wishes to have body parts cut off, well, it is very questionable whether or not a next-door neighbor would be able to escape liability for mayhem if that next-door neighbor follows the plaintiff's instructions and, say, chops off a hand or something like that. Also, with regard to consent, it's worth keeping in mind that a defendant might argue both an express and an implied consent as a defense to the same conduct. Next, consider privileges to intentional tort theories of liability. The privileges include self-defense or defense of others and protection of property. Those are the two big ones. It is worth remembering that reasonable, non-deadly force can be allowed under the circumstances for self-defense or defense of others, and deadly force is allowed to defend against a potentially deadly attack. But before using deadly force, a plaintiff typically will be required to exhaust avenues of escape or other alternatives to the use of deadly force. And remember that transferred intent can apply to a self-defense situation as well. This is a particularly complicated sub-issue. I will leave you to your practice to see how this material is tested. Realizing again that for all of this intentional tort material, we're only really talking about maybe half a dozen multi-state questions. It is worth being aware of the fact that protection of property interests allows for a narrower privilege than does protection of oneself or defense of others. Deadly force is never justified in the defense of property. Also, reasonable force is allowed to recapture chattel from someone that has just taken it from you. So if you're lying on the beach and somebody takes away your radio, you're allowed to snap your towel at that person or physically grab that radio back from the bad guy that tried to take it. But you're not allowed to pull out a deadly weapon and use deadly force to recapture an item of personal property. The threat of using unreasonable force probably is okay. So you can brandish a weapon at the person that took your radio, but you're not allowed to use that weapon, and if you do, your defense of property defense is not going to shield you from tort liability. There are a couple of other defenses that can come into play. They involve parental discipline. It's an interesting and evolving area of law, just the extent to which a parent is allowed to discipline his or her child. The protection of public interests. For example, protecting people from a crime that is in the process of being committed or from a natural disaster. Protection of public interests can be fairly broadly interpreted. Once again, you've got to look at the individual situation and analyze the facts. Necessity can be a defense to the various torts, particularly intentional torts to property. If it is necessary for me to flee a natural disaster and get on your property, I'm not going to be liable for trespass, but I will be liable for any damages that I cause as a result of my unauthorized entry onto the plaintiff's property. And that wraps up a consideration of defenses. And so now you have heard all you need to hear about the basics of intentional torts. As you go into practice, you're going to see plenty of additional fine points. At that point, I advise you to annotate your outline, keep track of the material as you learn it, and as you do so, use as few words as you can. Next, we will turn to the most important single topic in torts and the most tested issue on the multi-state bar exam, negligence.